concept of interracial relationships is probably nothing foreign to us. I mean, we're a class of liberal arts students in 2021, but really it's a relatively new concept. I mean, interracial marriage wasn't even legalized until 1967 in 16 different states. So clearly there's still controversy surrounding it since it's such a new concept. I mean, even some of you, in our survey we asked your likelihood of dating people of different races. Some of you weren't afraid to say, I would be not at all likely to date an Asian, a Hispanic, not knowing anything about the person, just their race. So our group wanted to analyze the connection between racial attitudes and familiarity and the frequency of interracial romantic communication. I'm Fiona and I worked with Jimmy, Kalia, and Colin on this project.
So for today, we're going to talk about, first, we're going to talk about literature review, which includes the theory and the previous studies. We're going to then go into our method, which includes the hypotheses and the variables. Variables meaning independent, dependent, and demographic variables. Lastly, we're going to talk about our results and then our discussion.
So getting into some of the theories, we have 3 different theories kind of overarching in our research. First is contact theory proposed by Alport, which basically states that sustained contact in a status equal setting between 2 different groups will promote tolerance and acceptance between the groups. So in the sort of realm of our research, we're looking at sustained contact between 2 different races or racial familiarity and how that affects your romantic communication. And then communication accommodation theory essentially states that we change the way we communicate based on the receiver of our messages. So in this case, we feel that people will change the way they romantically communicate based on their attitudes towards the receiver of their messages. And then communication theory of identity basically states that there's a reciprocal relationship between communication and identity, that communication creates identity and identity creates communication. In this case, we're looking at racial identity and romantic communication. This has been kind of studied in a few previous places. So first was Pacific Northwest University. They essentially had students have conversations about race, and then after the conversations, they rated their comfort level during those conversations. So that kind of looked at how their attitudes affected and changed their communication. The World Values Survey more generally asked the world about their values, in some case their racial values. So that's kind of where we pulled a lot of our questions about racial attitudes was from the World Values Survey. And then interactive dating in college, that's the closest to what we're looking at. It essentially studied interracial relationships at a private university and how previous in-group biases affected the likelihood of those relationships forming. So that's pretty close to what we're doing, but we're kind of filling in the gap because we're basically looking at variables combined. So we're looking at familiarity and attitudes and how it's directly related to romantic communication.
So some research questions we have on this topic is how do racial attitudes influence the frequency of interracial romantic communication? And then how does racial familiarity influence the frequency of interracial romantic communication? And then based off the theories Fiona said earlier, we had some hypotheses created that racial familiarity will increase the likelihood of respondents engaging in interracial relationships. And then a second one is that increased racial attitudes towards a race will increase the likelihood of somebody engaging in a romantic relationship.
And now we're going to our 2 independent variables, both categorical based on the yes/no answer options that we presented. The first one being racial attitudes and the second one being racial familiarity. First one here is going to be one of our questions that we asked about the racial attitudes. We provided a statement, many of our friends have different racial identities than me, yes or no. And here's another one, I appreciate diversity and perspectives from people of different racial identities than my own. And now looking into questions that or statements that we have for our familiarity. The area I grew up in continued where people have different racial groups in their own. And then my family consists of people with different racial identities than my own also.
Now we're going to talk about our dependent variables, which measures the frequency of romantic communication, which is a continuous based on the vast amount of answers that we gain from the questions that we asked. The dependent variables, variable questions we use in our survey are detailed questions, which required us to then use a Likert scale. So first we have, our first example is, how often have you engaged in romantic or intimate interactions with someone of a different race than you, which varies from never to 10 times or more. Our second example is, it is difficult to form a close, intimate relationship with people of racial identities different from your own, which people went from strongly to disagree to strongly agree.
So some demographic variables we did was race. So we can see a mass, like 50% is white or Caucasian. And then we asked this question in order to see how does different races see other races romantically, and then maybe is there a familiarity, maybe are more black people open to interracial relationships versus Hispanic or Latinx. And then we asked also about gender, because when we're talking about romance, often gender is important for people. Are women more likely to be in interracial relationships, or are men? And as you can see, we got a mass majority of females. So you can go ahead. And then we also asked, are people single or are they dating? And then we actually had a couple people who are married and divorced, which is interesting. So mass majority of people are single.
Now we're going to get into our results and our data analysis right now. This one right here is measuring racial familiarity. Many of our classmates have different racial identities than me. This one, 80% of people answered yes here at Rollins, so you know, which is what we basically did our survey on. Most students at Rollins, a lot of students here are in very diverse classes, so that one we saw how is more 80%. And then there are a few classes here that you take note of, which is why 20% answering no, because they may not feel like their classes are very diverse. Right here, familiarity again. The area criterion contain people from many different racial groups in their own. This one is measuring like the background experience and knowledge that they that they're comfortable with, or that they just have prior, like I said, prior knowledge to as well. Racial attitudes. I have many different friends with racial identities than me. 80% answering yes. Like I said, here again we did a survey for Rollins, and you can see how when you walk around campus, a lot of students may be walking with. I could be walking with Colin, I could be walking with Fee or Talia. You see how like the diverse groups here are and what their interaction is as well. I would be happy to have somebody with a different racial identity than my own as my professor. 90% answered, 96% answered yes. And this small percentage, it was kind of surprising to us, but at the same time, it kind of wasn't. Still seeing how people, personal opinions on things here as well.
Next, we're going to talk about how measuring the frequency of interracial romantic communication. One example was, how often have you engaged in intimate or romantic communication with someone? And as you can see, 38% said never, to 10 times or more with 12%. As you can see, many of us have been, have not interacted with someone of a different race, and you never know who you're talking to.
So we looked at sort of the variables separately, the independent variable and the dependent variables measured, and now we're going to kind of look at the combinations to see how we answered our research question. So here we asked, we presented the statement, my family consists of people with different racial identities than me. You see we have the yes and no categories. So 47% of people who do not have family with different racial identities said they would never interacted with someone of a different race romantically, versus only 19% of people who do have families that are diverse. So essentially we're stating that if you have a diverse family, based on our data, you'd be more likely to engage in an interracial relationship. And you can kind of see the other numbers as well, where 23% of people without a diverse family have only interacted once, and the higher categories are 10 or more times with people with a diverse family. And then looking at another example, we presented the statement, I have many friends with different racial identities than me. We kind of counted that as racial attitudes because you get to pick your friends. So we had the answers no and yes. For the people that said yes, 80% strongly agree with the statement, I would be friends with people with different racial identities than my own and would date them, versus only 36% of people who do not have many friends with different racial identities. So essentially showing that if you're willing to be friends with someone with a different race, you're probably more likely to also date them. So that's kind of the connection between having a positive racial attitude and having increased frequency of interracial romantic communication. And then a final example here, we presented the statement, I consume a lot of media that shows people of races different from my own. Media being social media, TV, books, things like that. And we have yes or no for that question. And then we asked, I feel more comfortable when flirting with people who are the same race as me versus a different race. 45% of people who have not consumed a lot of media with people of different races are neutral, versus only 20% of people who have consumed a lot of media. You have 32% of people who have consumed a lot of media with different races strongly disagreeing, essentially stating that they feel comfortable with different races as well as their own race, versus only 18%. So about half of people who have not consumed a lot of media showing different races are not as comfortable flirting with people of a different race versus their own. So that kind of shows the connection between our independent and dependent variables.
Some theoretical t-tests that we could use for our further data analysis, the analysis of variance test or the ANOVA test. We can use that to compare our two independent variables, racial attitudes and racial familiarity, against our dependent variable measuring the frequency of interracial romantic communication. And then we can also use the two-way ANOVA test, looking at the stronger influence of the independent variables against our dependent variable.
So we had a couple goals when we started this project. Obviously, we were all pretty curious about the topic. I mean, this group is made up of some people who are the result of interracial relationships, so it's something that kind of interested us. So one thing that I think we really learned was overall how to create a presentation. Obviously, we had to do an interview, we had to create a survey, learning a lot about Qualtrics and data analysis, which was really useful.
And then some challenges and limitations we faced was basically just the diversity of the respondents we got. So we had 124 responses, but out of those 124, 50% were white, and then I think we had 77 women, so mass majority women and white people. So we would like to, in the future, perhaps expand the scale of this to get a more diverse response, get more men, more people of color, perhaps, to get their input.
So yeah, talking about the future, one way that we can kind of expand this research would be to take it in online dating. We were really interested in Qualtrics and how much data we got, and we can't imagine how much data you could get from an app like Tinder or Bumble. So kind of creating some sort of way to measure people's racial attitudes, like giving out our survey on Tinder, and then seeing if that affects who they swipe on. So do they have positive racial attitudes and they're swiping on people of a lot of different races, or do they have negative racial attitudes and they never swipe on a black person? So it's kind of seeing that, but we had a lot of fun in this project, and thank you guys for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks.